Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride. Hey, Wildsiders. It's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday.
And we hope this is finding you well. And, I just wanted to kind of dive right into it and address the elephant in the room. And that is that Bailey and I want to send out heartfelt condolences to the families that are left behind of the victims. We've had two political assassinations, two individual events, one including Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark, and the other one, Charlie Kirk. And, I just hope that you guys hear us when we say that Bailey and I, we're just not advocates of political assassination. We are defenders of free speech. We exercise that in our own personal ways. And, our heart breaks for victims, our heart breaks for families. And that's why we do what we do, to give you guys resources and educate the masses as well as we can. And I just felt like I wanted to just start right off with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people will view this as doubling down because, there's been a lot of emotions and a lot of pushback for acknowledging Charlie Kirk's life and what he represented. And one of the things that I want to say before I get into the second thing that I'm going to say is there's a quote from Noam Chomsky, and it's one of my favorite quotes. And he said, "If you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you despise. Otherwise, you do not believe in it." And I think that is so absolutely incredibly powerful because it is very easy to support things you support and to denounce things you do not support. And the last thing that we're going to say about this, I have learned the hard way in my stubborn life that I've had to learn to do my own research. And I want to make it very clear to you guys that media is highly divisive and manipulative. Hardly anything that you see in the media at face value is ever what it is. So if you find yourself having a lot of hate and a lot of just acid in your tummy, from everything, no matter if it's the last 3 or 5 days or if it's the last 13 years, do your research. Find things in full context. Try to understand where the other side is coming from, because I think that that's the best way that we can go. And I know that that has helped me with my mental health. And I will digress at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Bailey and I, we receive emails from family members of victims on cases that we cover that will reach out and say, hey, you guys got some of this wrong, right? We've had those instances. And that's where we just, we're like, man, thank you so much for bringing that up to our attention. Humility is involved in that process.
Absolutely.
So, we challenge you to seek out truth, to seek out information, and try on some humility. Not that you're not, I'm not saying that in an aggressive way, but Bailey and I have had to really learn how to wear humility and sit with that in this process. So
yeah,
it's a hard thing. It's not an easy thing. But I do feel we've had growth.
Yeah.
Because people call us out on, hey, that's not right. So
absolutely.
Anywho.
And you have to learn to take it with grace too, right? And
Sure.
not as a personal attack. And I think when you can make mistakes with humility and learn from that, you grow exponentially as a human.
Yeah.
So, with all of that being said, we're going to shift gears here into this case. And so I am afraid to tell you guys that this case is going to be just as heavy in a totally different way than the last week in America,
Mm-hmm.
arguably all over the world. But this is going to be a heavy case. This is probably going to be a very highly triggering case. And so I think it's appropriate to give just kind of a mass trigger warning for this entire episode, that this whole episode revolves around child sexual abuse content and behavior. So um, that is going to be that. And then it's going to be interview week, and our interview is with Dr. Christopher Rom and his colleague Allison. They are out of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and they're phenomenal in what their work is around prevention. So, just a little disclaimer, there's a chance that we might not be able to release the episode Friday, but worst case scenario, we'll release it Saturday or Monday. We're just kind of waiting on some final back and forth details with our interviewees to finalize and then publish. Cool?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, you guys. So we will get into it. Formal apologies. This case happened this year, actually. It exploded in the beginning part of this year, and it happened in France. So, Chelsea and I are pretty, I'm trying to say really nice, politically correct words. We are not super smart when it comes to being able to pronounce things very well, but we will do our best.
I mean, it literally feels like I should say, I'm not a smart man and I don't know how to pronounce these words.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
it's real
like,
bad.
man almighty.
All right, you guys, take a deep breath. You're going to need it throughout this episode. Here we go. Some crimes aren't about a sudden explosion of violence. They begin long before the secret, invisible stirring of desires, the little shadows of urges no one wants to admit. Because what happens when those urges, left unchecked, spiral into something that is acted out rather than just festering from within. He wasn't just a man in the shadows. He was a surgeon, a figure of authority in a white coat, trusted, respected, and almost untouchable. Yet behind the veneer were impulses he would later claim surfaced only in middle age. But others, family, colleagues, even fragments of his own journals, hint that maybe the roots had been there far longer, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for opportunity.
And that's where the deeper questions live, not just in what happened, but in how it was allowed to keep happening. Compulsion met opportunity in hospital wards where children lay sedated. Institutions protected reputations instead of patients. Families were taught to be quiet, and colleagues turned away from whispers they didn't want to face. When silence becomes structural, woven into families, workplaces, even entire cultures, it's not just one man's crime. It's a system that lets him keep going. This is the shocking and gut-churning case of Joël Le Scouarnec.
Long before police ever stepped into his home, Joël Le Scouarnec was already living two sharply divided lives. Outwardly, he was the image of respectability, a surgeon in a white coat, someone who was trained, credentialed, and of course trusted. Colleagues praised his precision, noting that he was a good surgeon, precise and quick in his gestures, not very sociable, but still very professional. Parents handed him their children without hesitation. But as with most of the cases we cover, behind the exterior, something darker was there. Born in Paris on December 3rd, 1950, Le Scouarnec grew up in a Catholic working-class family. His father was a carpenter, his mother a concierge, and by all accounts, it seemed to be considered a wonderful childhood. It was ordinary and peaceful. After completing what we here in the US would consider high school, Le Scouarnec decided he wanted to save lives and become a doctor. During his studies, Le Scouarnec met healthcare assistant Marie France, and they married in 1974. Now, during their marriage, the two ended up having 3 beautiful boys, and at this point in time, to neighbors and colleagues, the Le Scouarnec family looked like a very loving, normal, conventional family. While starting a family with his wife, Marie France, Le Scouarnec began studying medicine at Nantes University, graduating in 1981, where he ended up specializing in gastrointestinal surgery. After obtaining his medical degree, his career traced a steady climb through hospitals across France. La Fontaine, Sacre-Cœur-en-Vanne, Lorient, and I don't know how to say this, you guys, I'm sorry, Quimperle, and Jean-Jacques Hospital, all different years up until his retirement in 2017. And yet, in later interrogations, Le Scouarnec would tell investigators about his secret urges that, as he claimed, only appeared in middle age. That claim, that the problem, quote, started late, became part of his ongoing narrative, but fragments from family memories and later from his own writings pointed in a completely different direction. A niece recalled troubling encounters when she was very young, far earlier than his account allowed. This is where prevention conversations begin. The uneasy hints that don't have a name at the time. A child feels uncomfortable. A family member senses something odd. But without language or frameworks, those signals get brushed aside as quirks. Silence gave him cover, and the irony is stark. The very career he built on trust placed him in constant contact with the children he would later be accused of harming.
Medicine in France, like it is in many countries, is an institution, and a surgeon represents authority, stability, and even safety. I feel like this is safe to say, no matter where you live or what your background is. Communities don't question the man in the white coat. They assume his presence is protective. And of course, we have things like the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors are pledged into doing no harm. They swear that with this oath. But institutions can also become shields. Families want to believe the best. Hospitals protect reputations. Those forces together create what sociologists call institutional silence. It doesn't mean no one ever notices something strange, but rather it means the observations never translate into action. So in the field of dentistry, we would call this supervised neglect. We pretty much are watching something bad happen. That silence let him move seamlessly through his career. Each hospital, each relocation functioned pretty much like a reset button. He left whispers behind, but carried authority with him. In that pattern, mobility without accountability, it's a red flag in many abuse cases. Prevention experts remind us that urges don't usually appear fully formed in middle age. They often start earlier, usually in adolescence, and calcify into lifelong patterns we ignore. Le Scouarnec's later statements, which were evasive and inconsistent, reveal as much about denial as about compulsion. And when denial meets silence, the outcome is predictable. A hidden trajectory, years in the making, unfolding behind trust of a white coat.
Now, the facade began to crack in 2017, not because of institutions, watchdogs, or colleagues, but because the voice of a child. A 6-year-old little girl told her parents that the neighbor across the street, an older, mild-mannered man, had abused her, and that neighbor was Dr. Joël Le Scouarnec. Now, instead of sitting on it, the little girl's parents went straight to the police. Kudos to them. And thankfully, investigators moved in quickly. As is the expectation with most sexual abuse allegations, perhaps, France police thought that they were preparing for a straightforward case. One disclosure, one suspect, one victim. But when they stepped inside his Jonzac home, what they found told a very, very different story. At first, during the search of the esteemed doctor's home, it was just unsettling details. Now, unsettling can be a pretty broad term. I think most of us would say freaking weird. There were wigs tucked away in little hidey holes, dolls posed strangely throughout the house, hidden compartments beneath the floorboards, enough to suggest that this was not a man with a single lapse, but someone with a pattern. But then came the discovery that changed everything. A locked room, and inside, a journal or a diary. Thousands of handwritten diary pages. Now, these weren't private musings, inner dialogues of his day-to-day monotony in his life. They were records, and more disgustingly, catalogs of children. Names, ages, sometimes even addresses, and sometimes even descriptions about what he had done to them. Nearly 200 names appeared in those notebooks alone. Alongside them sat spreadsheets detailing the precision, like medical charts, but written in his own hand. And then there was the digital archive. Over 300,000 photographs, more than 650 videos, not only pedophilic, but also zoophilic and scatological. It was not the evidence of a man who had slipped. It was a vault, curated, preserved, and waiting. And what made it even more disturbing was how long it had been allowed to exist. As investigators would come to find out, this vault held secrets that spanned decades.
I wish he would journal his successes in surgery and not children. These weren't artifacts of a secret no one could have guessed. They survived because nobody asked, nobody pushed, nobody wanted to see. The silence that protected him outside his home began within its walls. His sister Annie put it bluntly, quote, "I was taught to keep quiet." In his own diaries from the 1990s, Le Scouarnec described the dread when his wife discovered the truth. And he put it this way: "Catastrophe has struck. She knows I am a pedophile." But even when faced with that knowledge, Marie France deflected and minimized. At one point, she suggested a 5-year-old niece, a confirmed victim, had, quote, manipulated him, that the child had somehow loved the attention. The silence started at home and rippled outward into hospitals, into communities, into the professional network that shielded him, revealing how denial and minimization operates even inside his family, echoing the same silence and excuses seen at the institutional level.
Now, I just want to give a benefit of the doubt reminder. If you were married to somebody for, 15, 20 years and you find this stuff, denial is literally the brain's way to protect you when you cannot cope with the reality of the situation. Okay, so before we start, jumping onto Marie France, we do have to remember she was not the perpetrator in this. So we'll just kind of leave it at that. Now, this is the tremendous, unfortunate reality. Denial is pretty universal, and in this case, it didn't just come, like Chelsea said, from the institutions. It started and came from the people closest to him. It started at home and rippled outward into the hospitals and into the communities and into the professional networks. Denial and minimization weren't side notes of the story. They were the very central conditions that allowed this man to keep going. And it wasn't only his family who looked away, because this discovery in 2018 of all the stuff they found in Le Scouarnec's home, it was unbelievable, but it was not the first violation. So if you guys are pissed now, you're about to get way more pissed. Almost 2 full decades earlier, so back in the early 2000s, the FBI had already flagged Joël Le Scouarnec during a dark web child pornography investigation. In one of his own notes, he wrote, quote, "I am going to be registered as a pedophile. I am therefore forced to stop my activities on the internet. When will I be able to resume?"
Resume what? Resume his activities? Resume working as a surgeon?
Resume sexually assaulting children.
Good heavens.
After years of investigation, his arrest led to a conviction. In 2005, French authorities convicted Joël Le Scouarnec for possession of child sexual abuse images. Now, you would imagine that the consequences of this would be massive, but they were not. His wife, Marie-France, did leave him, even though they stayed married on paper until 2018. But legally, the punishment? He got a 4-month suspended sentence. He did not even serve jail time. To make it even more mind-boggling, he received no ban on working with minors, no mandatory treatment, despite psychiatric recommendations. He was allowed to keep his medical license where he continued working with children. What should have absolutely been a hard stop became just another door for him to walk through.
And I think we have to ask ourselves, how did this happen? How did a man who was publicly convicted for the possession of child sexual abuse material be allowed to continue working in a hospital with children? So apparently, a shortage outweighs hiring a convicted offender in France. Hospital director Michelle Qualms would go on to admit that she knowingly hired Le Scouarnec in 2008, despite the conviction, citing a shortage of surgeons and, quote, different perceptions at the time. Psychiatrist Thierry Bonvalot had tried to raise alarms, calling his continued practice a medical fiasco. But alas, no one listened. So Le Scouarnec continued practicing as a medical doctor for 13 years after his conviction. 13 years of access to patients. 13 additional years of access to minor patients. It would be 13 years before the 6-year-old neighbor, with bravery beyond her years, came forward with the allegations against Le Scouarnec. Now, after searching his home from top to bottom, and by the time investigators tallied the evidence, the scale was undeniable. The little girl's disclosure hadn't exposed a single crime, but it unraveled a sickeningly vast web. A voice became 184 formal complaints, 181 of them from people who had been children at the time. What began as one allegation pulled back the curtain of what would become the largest pedophilia case in France's history.
Joël Belloc, head of the Order of Physicians, would admit in court, quote, "With hindsight, it's obvious we could have done things differently," which is infuriating. These future words hung heavy and would ignite a fury and backlash unlike anything France had ever seen. When the denial curtain protecting Le Scouarnec was pulled, communities where he had worked suddenly had to ask themselves how many victims had walked through hospital doors without knowing, how many children had been treated by the surgeon everyone trusted. France, where public trust in doctors run deep, was forced to confront the unthinkable. A surgeon had been harming the very patients he had sworn to heal. Families who once brushed him off as eccentric or maybe even a little odd now faced the possibility that their children's names were in his secret, detestable notebooks. And here's where prevention and response collide. Institutions are built to react: police, courts, prisons. But prevention means noticing earlier, asking harder questions, building systems where children feel safe to disclose. Without that, silence festers. And silence had already cost years, because the 2005 conviction should have been the alarm bell. It should have been the first and last straw. Instead, bureaucracy and reputation shielded him. He kept getting hired. Colleagues trusted him. Parents kept handing their children over. Why would they not? They didn't know. It was what criminologists call institutional collusion through inertia. Not a deliberate cover-up, but a system too slow, too protective of itself, too unwilling to imagine the worst. And the result of this institutional collision? Another 12 years of unchecked access for a predator. Children sedated on hospital operating tables, where hospital beds turned into his hunting grounds.
The investigation revealed what his diaries had always known. This wasn't only about compulsion. It was about him relying on opportunity and the silence of the systems. Yet the scope of the journals also made prosecution daunting. Out of hundreds of names, investigators had to sift for cooperation, for evidence that could meet legal thresholds. Can you even imagine how complex and cumbersome, not to mention traumatic, that this kind of undertaking would have been? I mean, some of these cases were decades old. Regardless, the investigation pressed forward, contacting every mention of a victim to interview them, to find out some sort of cooperation or denial. They went from victim to victim to interview them about what would likely be the worst memories and experiences of their lives. So some victims had no memory or wanted no part of reliving it. Others, including relatives, came forward hesitantly, breaking the silence they had carried alone for years. Months after months, the investigation pushed on. Interview after interview, and hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of evidence scrutinized. But after 2 years, there was finally enough to bring a predator to trial. And by March 2020, the case finally reached the courtroom in Saintes, France. And it wasn't a quiet affair. The trial itself was a force of nature, both in reporting and really just enormity of the case. 470 accredited journalists and cartoonists descended on Venice. There were 67 lawyers for civil parties, 45 witnesses, 10 experts. There were 75 days of hearings. I mean, just sit with that. Just sit with those numbers for a second. That is a month and a half of just hearings. The courtroom simply couldn't contain the sheer enormity of the case. So the old law faculty was converted into overflow rooms, one for civil parties, one for the press, one for the public. I mean, it was its own moving system of trial and civilian logistics. Throughout the trial, because of the heinous nature of it, psychological support was offered. Even assistance dogs padded through the room to help comfort survivors as testimony unfolded. Journalists quickly called it the trial of the century, not because of celebrity, but because of the scale. 111, yes, 111 counts of rape, 189 counts of sexual assault, with the average age of his victim being just 11 years old. So combined, these 299 counts of sexual assault happened again and again during the stretch of over 25 years, from 1989 to 2014. And the abuse happened within the walls of a dozen hospitals, with many of the children, the victims, under anesthesia or waking from surgery. What should have been the safest moment in their young lives became the most exploited. In the courtroom, nobody could deny that the evidence against Joël Le Scouarnec was overwhelming, but nothing hit harder than his own words. So I am going to pause just for a second because this really does need a trigger warning. So I am going to read what he wrote in a journal. And obviously, if this makes you uncomfortable or you anticipate that it will, please skip forward. In one journal entry, he wrote, "I live with these thoughts every day. I fight them. I give into them and I write them down to make them real." Another was, "When I touch a child, it feels like I'm touching innocence itself. I know it's wrong. I know it is forbidden, and yet I return to it always."
Now, prosecutors argued his obsessive record keeping showed premeditation. A man who fantasized, planned, acted, and then relived his crimes. One line from his journals read, "Clara, 7 years old, in the corridor. She smiled when I spoke to her. She will forget me, but I will not forget her." And another, "My niece slept in the other room. I stood by her door, my hand trembling. I told myself not this time, but I don't always listen to myself." Every facet of a flawed system had to hear the horrific crimes in the descriptions that the same system had overlooked, excused, and even enabled for a quarter of a century. Another passage read, "At the hospital, I see them everywhere. Little girls with their mothers waiting for surgery. I smile. They trust me. They should not trust me." Sorry. That just gives me chills in the most disgusting way. That single sentence shattered the illusion of safety between patient and doctor. The courtroom was sickened and stunned. The inner thoughts of one of France's most prolific child abusers, relishing in the innocence of his victims. During the trial, Le Scouarnec testified, and he admitted openly. He said, "For 30 years I acted without any qualms and with a single objective, to commit sexual assaults as often as I could." The words that victims and their families had to sit through, to relive the absolute horror of their darkest moments facing their literal boogeyman. There was no denying Le Scouarnec's sexual compulsions that marked him a serial offender, but compulsions alone don't explain the sheer scale. The court argued that alongside compulsion, opportunity mattered just as much. Hospitals had given him the proximity to sedated children, patients and victims too groggy, too weak, or too trusting to resist. And the typologies made his case even more horrifying. Experts often distinguish offenders by the ages they target. You have pedophiles towards the prepubescent children. You have hebephiles towards the early adolescents, and you have ephebophiles towards the older teens. But Le Scouarnec's journals spanned the full age range, 6 years old, teenagers, and early adolescents. He wasn't confined to one category. He was what researchers call a generalist offender. That blurred pattern makes prevention harder because systems often look for kind of a single profile. The psychiatric assessment painted him as a man that was inhabited by a feeling of impunity and omnipotence, incapable of guilt, basically, convinced he was giving children tenderness and love. He described himself in writings as, quote, a great pervert, at the same time an exhibitionist, a voyeur, a sadist, a masochist, a scatologist, a fetishist, and a pedophile. And I'm very happy about that. Could you guys even imagine? Could you even imagine sitting in that courtroom, hearing these words and him saying, yep, this is me. And I'm very happy about that. And I have one objective in life, and it's to continue to do it over and over again. His journal entries and the spreadsheets, they weren't just trophies, because a lot of people, obviously, those were part of his trophies. But psychologists describe it more as cognitive scaffolding, tools predators use to normalize their behavior, to rehearse and to relive. By writing, cataloging, and reading, he reinforced his compulsions. There was a narcissistic layer to it. He didn't only abuse, he archived. He treated his crimes like a legacy worth preserving.
I think that's interesting that you used the words normalize their behavior, right? When talking about psychologists describing it as cognitive scaffolding, because, we talk about the act of desensitizing, right? And if you see something or hear something over and over, we get desensitized to it. And I've always thought to myself, why the journaling and why the looping of it and the reliving it? You made a really good point. And what if it's a way for them in their struggle of thinking that it's wrong? In a way, it kind of starts desensitizing them to it or normalizing it for themselves.
Maybe. But I think he's just a gross fucking dude. Like, at the end of the day.
I mean, fair.
So, like, a scatologist, or, scatologist, whatever. Do we want to guess what that is, right? He described himself as an exhibitionist, a voyeur, sadist, masochist, and a scatologist, a fetishist, and a pedophile.
I mean, the only thing I know about scatting is like when jazz players go like, that's the only thing I know about scat.
Yeah. No, a scatologist is a person who studies feces.
Oh,
yeah.
No.
And so I think you have different variations of that word, like a true, quote, scatologist or whatever probably does study it on behalf of a, health organization to understand blah, 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 blah.
No.
In my personal opinion, this dude, he was a fetishist and he was probably obsessed with shit too. So there was a lot wrong in this man's head. You know what I mean?
Well, I was today years old when I heard about that one, when I learned that one.
Yeah, it's pretty gross. Yeah.
So continuing on, we've talked about the journals and we've talked about the entries, and then there were the testimonies from Le Scouarnec's own family. Le Scouarnec's sister Annie, like we had talked about before, was told, or as she put it, taught to keep quiet. His 3 sons, because do remember he was married with 3 boys, described a cultured father who loved books and holidays. Yet one admitted he now never leaves his toddler alone with anyone. If my father could do this, then my neighbor could, my partner could, anyone. Another one of the sons revealed that he himself had been abused by Le Scouarnec, so abused by his own father. A niece even testified, describing fragmented memories she had buried until confronted with his journals. Then came the bombshell. Mid-trial, Le Scouarnec admitted he had even abused his own granddaughter when she was under 5, and the court gave out a collective gasp. Then they froze. His eldest son and his son's partner fled in tears, supported by a psychologist. That revelation made clear the abuse had penetrated every layer of his family, not just his hospitals, showing a multi-generational cycle of abuse and silence. If that wasn't enough by itself, attendees had to sit and listen to how the defense tried to frame Le Scouarnec's writings as fantasy. Like the horrors of the victims weren't real, but just evil delusions conjured by his imagination. But the prosecutors weren't having it, thankfully. They countered with the overlap between diary pages, named children, and medical records, corroborating victims' testimonies that helped fill in the blanks. They were ensuring that the same cracks that Le Scouarnec slipped through for 25 years would not allow him to slip through again. And the pain was practically palpable. Public outrage echoed. Communities where he worked began sifting through records, realizing how long suspicion had been dismissed. Families remembered brushing off their children's discomfort. Survivors wrote letters about depression, broken marriages, fear of doctors even. One father broke down in court describing how his wife, who later died of cancer, never forgave herself for telling their son as he was wheeled into surgery, "Everything will be okay."
But despite the mountain of evidence laid out by prosecutors, denial didn't just live inside his family. It echoed throughout the wider circles around him. One of Le Scouarnec's longtime friends, Christian D., treated the proceedings like a nuisance. He mocked questions, shrugged off testimony, and at one point even said that he would gladly house Le Scouarnec if he were ever released. To the survivors watching and listening to this, it was like the very silence that had protected him for decades, just having a face to it, right? Literal humans that you can point at and say, you're a part of this, right? You're a part of my pain. And then there was Marie France, his ex-wife. For years, his diaries hinted that she knew more than she admitted. Remember, he said, "Catastrophe has struck. She knows I'm a pedophile." And on the stand, rather than confront the reality, she deflected. She went so far as to suggest that her own 5-year-old niece, the confirmed victim, had again manipulated her ex-husband, that the child had somehow loved the attention. It was a statement so overwhelmingly shocking and insensitive and unbelievable that many of the victims' gallery just gasped. And it was only when prosecutors forced her to confront indecent photo montages of her own son did her composure crack. For survivors, it was just unbearable, you guys. It was unbearable. Some stood up and walked out in protest. Others just sat frozen, hands over their faces, just fighting back the tears, the horrors, the memories. Communities erupted in scrutiny, right? Because these weren't just personal betrayals. These were echoes of the same cultural reflex that had let him hide in plain sight. The instinct to minimize, to excuse, to protect reputations, even at the cost of children's safety. People were just beside themselves with the betrayal. In that courtroom, denial wasn't abstract. It was alive, speaking back to them, a reminder that silence itself can wound just as deeply as the crimes.
For weeks, the courtroom had been drowning in contradictions, diaries that left no doubt, survivors who spoke with unbearable clarity, and denials from those closest to him that cut just as deep. The weight of it all pressed towards one unavoidable question. How would the court respond? Would the law finally name what silence had hidden for decades? And then on March 30th, 2020, after one of the most shocking and emotionally draining trials in modern France, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Guilty of sexually assaulting 4 children, his niece, his young neighbor, and 2 patients. The word carried like a thunderclap through the chamber. 1 syllable. Trying to contain decades of devastation. But what came next was what survivors had both waited for and dreaded: the punishment, the sentencing. The judge looked past Le Scouarnec and addressed the greater wound. This court punishes you, Monsieur Le Scouarnec, but it also punishes silence. The silence that protected you and the silence you relied on. And then came the numbers. Not hundreds of years, not a lifetime behind bars. Just 25. Because under French law, sentences cannot be stacked. Whether you rape 1 child or hundreds, the ceiling is the same. So for a man accused of abusing nearly 300 children over the course of 25 years, the state could only give him 25 years in prison with psychiatric monitoring. And let me tell you guys, the reaction was purely visceral. Survivors called the outcome humiliating and shouted shame on the justice system as the verdict was read. Some wept, others walked out. One relative put it in words that cut through the chamber. We lost our childhoods twice. Once when it happened, and again when nobody believed us. Le Scouarnec himself had once written, I write everything down because nobody reads it. Nobody looks. Nobody wants to. For decades, he was right. And even as the gavel fell, many wondered if that silence had truly been broken or only acknowledged too late.
Yet even as the sentence was imposed, unease lingered because everyone in the room knew what the trial had not captured, that the charges before the jury were only a fraction of the whole. And that's the haunting truth. Those 4 children were just the beginning. Investigators knew it, the court knew it, and the people knew it. Even Le Scouarnec admitted it. 2 diary entries crystallized his awareness. Quote, I am guilty of more than this. These diaries, they are my life. You do not have enough time to count them all. I think of myself as 2 men. One, the surgeon, with steady hands and skill. The other, a shadow who waits for the chance to touch what he should not. The shadow always wins. But the story didn't end in 2020. That was the first trial, the one that sentenced Le Scouarnec to 25 years for 4 victims. That was only the opening chapter. 5 years later, in 2025, there was a second trial. This time, the charges reflected the staggering scale of his diaries and evidence, the 299 counts of rape and sexual assault across decades and hospitals. Prosecutor Stephanie Kellenberger demanded the maximum 20-year sentence and urged the court to go further, to detain Le Scouarnec in a secure treatment center after prison, citing his high risk of reoffending. Defense lawyers conceded he would accept the sentence, but asked the court to consider his admissions of guilt as signs of responsibility. Le Scouarnec himself told the judges he wasn't asking for leniency, only, quote, the right to become a better person. On May 28th of 2025, the verdict came. Guilty on 299 counts. The punishment? 20 years in prison, the maximum under French law, to run concurrently with his 2020 sentence. The court rejected the request for post-release supervision. And for victims, understandably, this was absolutely devastating. Hundreds of assaults, decades of silence, and still the same cap as a single offense. In the U.S., prosecutors noted that his crimes would have carried sentences stretching into the thousands of years. But like Chelsea said, in France, unfortunately, 25 years was the ceiling. And for survivors, that gap was not legal nuance. It was proof that the law itself was part of the system, and part of a system that hadn't caught up with the magnitude of the harm. One survivor spoke about the betrayal out loud, saying, "We were patients and he was our doctor. You go to a doctor to be healed, not destroyed." And that's why this case still matters. Because if a surgeon can abuse children for nearly 3 decades, document it in quite literally thousands of pages, and still go on practicing after a conviction, mind you, then silence is not just protection. It is now at this point absolutely complicity. And when the tally was finally made, the scale was undeniable. Hundreds of victims etched into journals and confirmed in complaints, cementing this again as the largest pedophilia case in France's history.
It was the reckoning survivors had demanded for decades, but it also left a question hanging in the air, one that a verdict alone it just could never answer. Because once the gavel fell, the story, it really never ends. The damage remains, and so does the fear. How many more cases like this are hiding in silence right now? How do you stop another predator before 30 years of harm are already done? That's where we turn next, to prevention, to the science of intervening early, and to a conversation with Dr. Christopher Rahm, whose work asks the question France never did. What does it look like to catch this before it happens?
Now, as we all know, the Le Scouarnec case doesn't exist in isolation. Set it alongside the Catholic Church cover-ups, Larry Nassar in the U.S. gymnastics, or the Welcome to Video network that we covered, I think, last year. And one theme is impossible to ignore: systems inadvertently protecting predators. Regarding Joël Le Scouarnec, survivor Manon Lemoyne captured it in a single sentence. They're trying to make him out to be a monster, but the monster is the society that created him and allowed him to continue. And that's why we chose this case to lead into our next conversation, because again, how do you stop it before it happens again?
And that's where our interview with Dr. Christopher Rom comes in. His research group in Sweden is at the forefront of prevention science, approaching pedophilia not only as a moral and legal crisis, but as a neuropsychiatric problem that can be studied, understood, and critically treated before it turns into harm.
It's work that bridges psychiatry, nursing, and criminal justice, united by a single goal: to stop the abuse before it starts. Which is why, after telling the story of a surgeon who documented nearly 30 years of compulsion unchecked, we want to ask the next urgent question: what does it look like to intervene sooner? What if he had gone through a program like that before? Could we have prevented nearly 300 victims? Right? That's the conversation that we will bring to you next: prevention, treatment, and whether society is ready to confront this problem before another Joël Le Scouarnec ever reaches a hospital ward.
And that, our dear listeners, is the case of Joël Le Scouarnec, a surgeon who turned hospitals into hunting grounds and whose diaries exposed not just his crimes, but the multifaceted failures that let them fester.
You guys, that was tough. That was tough.
It's like a true Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, almost like, what is it? Mary Frankenstein. I can't think of the author right now off the top of my head. I'm blanking.
Mary Shelley.
Mary Shelley. There we go.
Yeah.
Frankenstein, right? It's just this bizarre tension, right, of him being able to know that he turns into this awful human being. Well, I say turns into it, right? But kind of that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, but then also kind of understanding that the system is creating his breeding grounds, or his hunting grounds, I should say. Whoa, that the hospitals are creating these hunting grounds for him.
I think of Men in Black,
Mm-hmm.
Edgar, when he gets overtaken by the alien.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
That is always a visual representation of sex offenders to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like they're never really two different people, right? They're always that inside, and the skin, the person on the outside gets more and more like ragged and worn.
Mm-hmm.
That's like in my brain how I picture it. And people gotta trust that. You gotta trust that gut, man. You gotta trust that gut.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta say, this dude's weird, and there is absolutely no harm in being like, yeah, I want a different doctor, or I want a different that. Like, it is time that we stop allowing people to just be weird. That sounded wrong. I mean, like, that feeling, right? That feeling of just like, ugh, this dude's weird, he's creepy. So I have learned, when I have that response, that's usually a really big red flag, especially if it's coming from me.
I know. And you and I talk a lot about this, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. But I do think that I want to also say that not everybody gets it. Not everybody gets those red flags. There are so many people that are just absolutely bushwhacked.
That's true.
And I don't ever want a listener to be like, well, what's wrong with me? Because I didn't see those red flags. I truly was surprised.
Yeah. I mean, shame on me
that's
for
also true. I think some people are in experiences, or they're in situations where they could get these red flags. And there are people who are not, or they just don't get these red flags. And again, that's why, it's so important to say something, to act on. If you are that one, you're not acting upon yourself. You're also acting on the people who could be exposed to it, who are not, for whatever reason, going to receive those red flags. So don't ever hear us say that, what did you miss? Everybody experiences red flags. That's not at all what we're saying. But if you do, have that gut feeling. Bailey and I give you permission to act upon it.
To tell them that they're weird and to kick rocks.
Yeah. Yes.
You know what I
That is
mean?
okay.
And I also wonder, like taking my therapist hat off, I just also wonder if there are always red flags, but we have been familially and socially groomed, and I don't mean that in a malicious way,
Right.
but groomed or molded to suppress that so much that you really don't recognize it until afterwards, right? Until, I mean, I don't know. I always go back to, it's that story of the, I really need to look it up by this point because I keep saying this and I always forget to look it up. But the king and the robes and the naked king,
Yeah.
the Hans Christian,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. The emperor's new clothes.
I think you're thinking the Emperor's New Groove.
No, I'm not.
Is it literally called the Emperor's New Clothes?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I think you're thinking of dancing llamas
No.
and saggy boobies with long eyelashes.
No. The Emperor's New Clothes. It is a folk tale The Emperor's New Clothes, a literary folk tale written by the Danish author Hans Christian Andersen.
Oh, well, look at that.
The Emperor's New Clothes.
Okay, so all about that, basically, the thing that I remember from this story is this: he's walking through the whole story. You gotta read it, right? But long story short, he's walking through the streets naked, and the peasants are like, "Oh, look how beautiful our king is in his beautiful robes." Blah, blah, blah. And a little kid turns to his dad, is just like, "Why is the emperor naked?" And the dad is like, "Shh. Do you not see the king's beautiful purple robes," or whatever it is?
Wink, nod, nod.
Hey, you're funny. Quit joking around, right? And we subconsciously do that so often, and we don't mean to. But if you would have asked me before I became a therapist and I had a daughter or a child, it doesn't matter. We were taught, Chelsea and I were even taught, and again, not in a malicious way, but if somebody wants to hug you, you go and give them a hug.
Sure.
Go and give your grandpa a hug.
Yep.
Go give your grandma a hug.
Yep.
We're leaving. We're saying hi. Give them a hug. They want to give you a hug, right? If they want to kiss you on the cheek, they kiss you on the cheek. Like, there's not really any discussion around that.
Yep.
But now, with my daughter, it's very much, if somebody says, "Come here, give me a hug," and she doesn't want to,
Yeah.
I don't tell her to go do it. And if the adult asks again, then I will set that boundary for her.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to make this sound so melodramatic. You don't have to make it a big deal. You can make it a very nonchalant kind of thing. Hey, sweetheart, come give grandpa a hug, or come give uncle whoever a hug, or it doesn't matter. And she goes, "No." Then I'll just be like, "Girl said no. She don't want you, huh? You know what I mean?"
Sure.
And we kind of laugh about it.
Yeah.
But I think it's those moments that we have to really pay attention to, because we are conditioned socially and possibly even familially to ignore our intuition.
Yeah, absolutely. I have caught myself doing that more since we've talked about these things. I had a situation happen, ran into a friend of mine and her kids at Sam's, and I was just like, "Hey, sister, how's it going?" And waved, to her, didn't try to give her a hug or a high five or anything. And she just wasn't having it that day, right? The little girl. And of course, the mom was like, "Hey, you need to say hi to Miss Chelsea," And I just was like, it's okay. She does not have to, if that is not what she's feeling, and if she's uncomfortable with that, I think it's okay. I think it's okay if you,
I think it's a morally tricky line at that point, like, because you do need, I think that you do need to teach children that, like, you do need to have conversations and converse And yes, you can respect your, boundaries and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, like, sometimes you just need to be like, say hi.
Sure.
Stop being rude.
Yeah.
I don't care if you're feeling bad, because in life you can feel bad, but you still have to, like, go about life socially within a norm, right?
No.
But I totally get what you're saying. But that's why this stuff's so hard. It's because there's no right answer, and it's always dependent upon an individual situation, a circumstance,
Sure.
family history, trauma history. I mean, there's 1,000 things that impact it. So,
well, I'm going to take your response and I'm going to raise you as response and say, I think that by us not forcing them or shaming them and letting them come to it on their own time, especially when they're little, is maybe a healthy thing, because she did warm up once her little world, found its equilibrium, right?
sure. I don't see Chelsea's face, but her bobbleneck, every word, she was like, I think that I'm going to raise you a question.
What?
It was like that. It was like that.
What? Chicken head.
Like a little snake. I'm a snake. Yeah. So, again, you guys, listen to the interview with Dr. Rom. Chelsea's actually not in that interview because, I don't know, she was a loser that week. She was probably like, trying to get her master's or something. I think it was the week that you were like vomiting ill, or maybe because we had like 3 interviews that week.
Oh yeah. I have no recollection of you even doing this interview. So there's a good chance
you weren't there.
Yeah, there was a good chance that I was literally like emotionally, spiritually, and mentally out of commission. So
yeah.
Anywho.
But it works out because with me and then the 2 interviewees, there are 3 voices.
Oh yeah, it gets a little tricky when there's 4.
It gets a lot when there's a little bit more people on there.
Yeah.
But that's why I said in last week's episode that this is going to be probably our most controversial interview. And so we wanted to come back swinging into this game.
Yeah.
And we've got some other cool things coming down the pike. And as always, you guys, try to give people the benefit of the doubt. Try to be a good human being. Do your own research. Take care of yourself and your family. And as always, thanks for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy ride.
And we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.